Naruto Uzumaki was used to being alone. The streets of Konoha were always bustling with life, but to him, they were little more than a sea of faces that turned away, whispers that followed him like a constant shadow. The villagers' hatred burned in his back, their disdain so palpable that he could feel it even when they weren't looking. The fox spirit sealed inside him, the Nine Tails, was the source of their scorn. They saw him as nothing more than a vessel for the monster that had once wreaked havoc on the village. Yet, Naruto had always been an optimistic child. He would laugh, run, and shout his dreams, despite the cold glares that pierced his soul. But as the years passed, the weight of the villagers' hatred grew heavier. At night, when the laughter of his classmates echoed in the distance, Naruto would often find himself staring at the stars, wondering what it was like to be like everyone else, to belong. The nightmares started quietly at first. Faint whispers calling his name in the dark. A sense of suffocating weight pressing against him, as though something was just out of his reach. But then, the dreams grew darker. Flames licked at his skin, and chains wrapped around his body, their rusted iron digging into his flesh. Each night, they became more vivid, more intense, until he woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't understand what it meant. His chakra, which had always been wild and uncontrollable, started to behave strangely. Sometimes, it pulsed violently within him, as if some unseen force was pushing it to the surface. His strength increased unnaturally, like he was being filled with energy he couldn't contain. One afternoon, the academy was holding a sparring session. Naruto faced off against Kiba Inyazuka, a classmate he had always felt a strange rivalry with. The challenge had been simple enough, a friendly match. But as the fight progressed, Naruto's frustration, his anger at the world, began to bubble up to the surface. Kiba was taunting him, calling him names, mocking him for the very thing that had made him an outcast. Naruto's fists clenched, his body trembling with the fury that had been building inside him for so long. It wasn't just Kiba, it was the whole village, everyone who had ever looked at him like he was nothing more than a burden. His chakra flared violently. Then it happened. A burst of dark energy exploded from him, a wave of raw power that sent Kiba flying backwards, crashing into the training walls with a sickening thud. The class fell silent. The energy in the air crackled with danger, and Naruto stood there, his chest heaving as he struggled to control the chaotic power surging through his veins. What was that?" whispered one of his classmates, fear evident in their voice. Naruto looked down at his hands, stunned and confused. The dark energy had come from him, yet he didn't understand how or why. His body felt different, stronger, more dangerous. He didn't know how to control it. Kiba groaned, slowly standing up, a dazed expression on his face. "What the hell, Naruto? What did you do to me?" Naruto's mind was racing. His classmates were looking at him in shock, fear creeping into their eyes. He wanted to explain, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. He could see it in their eyes, the same thing he always saw, fear. Before anyone could say anything else, Iruka-sensei rushed forward, his face pale. "Naruto, what was that?" he demanded, though the question was more of an accusation. He had seen Naruto struggle with his chakra control before, but this was something else. I don't know," Naruto said, his voice trembling, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming power that still coursed through him. "It just happened." Iruka's expression softened for a moment, but his eyes still held caution. "You need to learn to control your emotions, Naruto. If you don't, something worse will happen." But Naruto couldn't focus on Iruka's words. The voice was back, the one from his dreams, the one that had haunted his sleep for so long. It wasn't just in his mind anymore, it was real, ringing in his ears. "Pathetic," the voice sneered. "You're nothing but a puppet, bound by chains that you cannot see, ruled by emotions you cannot control. But I can help you, boy. I can give you the power you seek, the power to crush them all. Naruto froze, his heart racing. The voice, it was familiar, yet alien. It was so much more than a whisper now, its tone commanding and authoritative. It spoke with the strength that Naruto had never heard before. Who are you? Naruto whispered, his voice barely audible. I am Zerth, the voice replied. The Demon King sealed within you. And I am offering you the power to end this. The power to make them bow before you, to earn the respect you crave. Naruto's pulse quickened. This voice, this Zerth, spoke of power, the very thing he had always longed for. Respect. A sense of belonging. The ability to crush those who had mocked him, who had hated him, for something he couldn't control. He was tempted. So tempted. But how do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know you won't just use me? Naruto whispered, uncertainty creeping into his voice. Zereth's laughter was dark, hollow. You doubt me? How amusing. You've been abandoned by your village, cursed to live as nothing more than a pariah. And now, when I offer you the power to change all of that, you hesitate. The voice softened, coaxing. I will give you everything. Power beyond your wildest dreams. You will never again feel weak. You will never again be alone. Naruto closed his eyes, torn. His heart ached with the need to be understood, to be accepted. To finally take control of his life, instead of being tossed around by the whims of fate and the hatred of others. But was he willing to make a deal with the demon to achieve that? Before he could decide, a sudden knock on the door of his mind broke through the conversation. Naruto. It was the voice of the third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi. Naruto's mind snapped back to reality. He hadn't realized he had been standing in the middle of the academy's courtyard, lost in thought. Are you all right, Naruto? Hiruzen's voice was soft, kind, but there was a weight in his words. Hiruzen had always treated Naruto with an odd mixture of kindness and wariness, and Naruto could never quite understand why. I'm fine, Naruto muttered, shaking his head to clear the fog of doubt that had settled over him. Just thinking. The Hokage's eyes studied him closely. The villagers, they've been getting more hostile again, haven't they? Naruto nodded. Yeah. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. They hate me, Hokage-sama. They always will. Hiruzen sighed, his expression clouding with a sadness that Naruto couldn't understand. It's not your fault, Naruto. You must know that. But it's true, isn't it? It's because of the 9 tails. Because of what's inside me. I'll never be one of them, will I? Naruto's voice cracked, the anger and sadness rising in his chest. Hiruzen placed a hand on his shoulder. No, Naruto. You're not defined by the 9 tails. You're your own person, and your strength is yours alone. But you must be careful. There are forces both within and outside you that could lead you down a dangerous path. Naruto looked up at the Hokage, confused. What do you mean? The Hokage's gaze shifted away, his eyes clouded with the regret that Naruto didn't understand. There are things about you, Naruto, that I cannot explain. I can only offer you guidance, but the path you choose is yours. Just remember, power comes with a cost. Naruto stared at him, unsure of what to say. Before he could ask more, the Hokage turned to leave, his steps slow, as if weighed down by the burdens of his age. But the voice, Zerth, lingered in Naruto's mind, waiting. Will you accept my gift? The voice asked, insistent. Will you accept the power to make them pay? Naruto closed his eyes, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The anger inside him, the pain of being alone, the desire for revenge, it all seemed to swell within him. He was tired of being weak. Tired of being alone. I'll do it, Naruto whispered, his voice steady now. "I'll accept your power." The darkness inside him roared to life. Zerth chuckled, a sound filled with both malice and promise. "Then you shall have it, boy. And you will never be the same again." Naruto's world turned black. And in that moment, he felt something inside him shift, something dark, something powerful, something that was no longer his own. Naruto's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fury. The more the voice inside him whispered, the more he felt a growing desire to understand who know what he truly was. Zerth, the Demon King, had claimed dominion over him, promising unimaginable power and an end to his suffering. But that offer came with an underlying promise of destruction. The voice was both a curse and a temptation, a reflection of the rage that had been festering inside him for years. As the days passed, Naruto's thoughts were consumed with the question that burned within him: what is this power? His body had changed since that fateful sparring session. He could feel it every time his chakra flared up, pulsing and thrumming with an unnatural intensity. The power Zerth had given him was unlike anything Naruto had ever felt before, and it terrified him. Yet, part of him was exhilarated by it. What if he could master it? What if this power was the key to finally gaining the respect he so desperately craved? It was then that a plan began to form in Naruto's mind. The Hokage's words about power and its consequences echoed in his thoughts, but Naruto wasn't one to be swayed by warnings anymore. If there was one thing he had learned from the villagers, it was that no one was ever going to give him the answers he sought. He had to take matters into his own hands. Late one night, when the streets of Konoha were silent and the moon hung high in the sky, Naruto sneaked into the Hokage's archives. His heart pounded as he moved through the shadows, avoiding the village guards and the watchful eyes of the shinobi who patrolled the area. He had no clear idea of what he was looking for, but his instincts told him that somewhere, hidden within the dusty scrolls and ancient tomes of the Hokage's library, lay the answers he needed. His hands trembled with both excitement and fear as he sifted through countless scrolls, his eyes scanning for anything that could provide a clue about Zerth, or even just his true origins. Naruto had never been much of a scholar, but tonight, something was driving him, a need to understand the darkness that had begun to take root inside him. It wasn't long before he found it, a tattered scroll buried deep in a forgotten corner of the library. It was old, so old that the parchment had begun to crumble at the edges. The text was written in an ancient script, one that Naruto could barely decipher. But as he read, a chill ran down his spine. The scroll spoke of a powerful being known as Zerth, the Demon King, sealed away centuries ago by the first Hokage. Zerth was not merely a demon, he was a conqueror, a force of destruction that commanded armies of darkness and had brought entire nations to ruin. His power was unmatched, and his thirst for dominance was insatiable. The scroll detailed how Zereth's power was so great that the first Hokage had been forced to imprison him within a human vessel, a child who would carry the demon's spirit and chakra for eternity. Naruto's blood ran cold as the realization struck him. The voice in his head, the strange power coursing through his veins, it wasn't a coincidence. He had been marked from birth to carry this burden. Zerth had been sealed within him, just as the scroll described. But why hadn't anyone told him this? Why had the Hokage kept the secret from him? Overwhelmed with emotion, Naruto stood in the dim light of the archive, clutching the scroll in his hands as his mind raced. The anger that had been simmering inside him for years now flared up with renewed intensity. They knew, he thought. They all knew. The Hokage, the villagers, even my parents, everyone knew the truth, but they kept it from me. His hands clenched into fists, and a wave of dark chakras surged around him. The power that had once felt foreign and terrifying was now a part of him, and it was calling to him, urging him to embrace it fully. The more he read, the clearer it became. Zerth had been sealed away, but Naruto's body was the vessel, the prison that held the demon's power. He was never meant to be free. He was a weapon, a tool, an unwilling host to an ancient and malevolent force. Suddenly, Naruto's thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of a door opening. He froze, heart hammering in his chest. It was the Hokage. Hiruzen Sarutobi had always been a man of wisdom and compassion, but tonight, there was a certain heaviness in his steps, as if he knew what Naruto had discovered. "I knew you would find it," the Hokage said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a burden that had been borne for far too long. Naruto turned to face him, his eyes narrowing with a mix of confusion and anger. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice shaking with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me that I was carrying a demon inside me? That I'm nothing more than a vessel for Zerth's power?" The Hokage looked down, unable to meet Naruto's gaze. "Naruto, it was never my choice to keep this from you. But the truth was too dangerous." "Dangerous?" Naruto echoed, his voice rising in frustration. "You think I couldn't handle it? All this time, I've been living a lie, and you want to tell me it was for my own good?" Hiruzen's face hardened, and he stepped forward, placing a hand on Naruto's shoulder. "I've watched you grow up, Naruto. You've always been determined, always wanted to prove yourself. But the truth is, the power within you is not something that can be controlled easily. Zerth was sealed away for a reason. His power is destructive, and if you allow it to consume you, there will be no turning back." Naruto shook off the Hokage's hand, his eyes burning with defiance. "I've lived my whole life being treated like a monster. I've never had control over anything. Maybe it's time I take control for once. Maybe it's time I stop hiding." "Don't be foolish, Naruto," Hiruzen warned, his voice filled with desperation. "The path you are considering will only lead to ruin. I don't want to see you become another casualty of power. The village already sees you as a weapon, as a threat. Don't give them a reason to be right." But Naruto wasn't listening anymore. His heart was pounding, his mind filled with the promise of power. Zerth's voice echoed in his ears, urging him to act, to take what was rightfully his. As the Hokage's words fell on deaf ears, Naruto turned and stormed out of the archives, the scroll clutched tightly in his hands. He wasn't going to let anyone hold him back anymore. Not the Hokage, not the villagers, no one. He needed to understand this power. He needed to prove to everyone that he wasn't weak. That he wasn't just the container of the Nine Tails. He was Naruto Uzumaki, and he was going to show them all what true strength was. The days that followed were filled with dark experimentation. Naruto would sneak away to the forests on the outskirts of the village, his mind consumed by the need to control the dark chakra that thrummed within him. He would focus all his energy, pushing his limits, testing the boundaries of his newfound power. Sometimes, he could feel it coursing through him like a wildfire, overwhelming and uncontrollable. Other times, it was as if he was standing at the edge of an abyss, staring into a darkness that threatened to consume him entirely. One evening, while deep in the forest, Naruto let his anger take control. His chakra exploded outward, a violent surge of dark energy that tore through the trees, reducing them to splinters in an instant. The ground cracked beneath him, the very earth shaking with the force of his power. As the dust settled, Naruto stood alone in the ruined landscape, his chest heaving as the adrenaline slowly faded. He looked around at the devastation he had caused, the charred remains of the trees and the broken earth. "This is it," he muttered, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. "This is what I'm capable of." But even as the thrill of power coursed through him, a cold sense of dread settled in his stomach. The rumors would spread quickly. The villagers would hear of this destruction. They would call him a monster just like they always had. Yet, a part of Naruto didn't care anymore. What had he ever gained by being the good boy, the obedient child? Respect? No. A sense of belonging? That was a lie. This power was his. And he would control it. He would prove them all wrong. The days following Naruto's accidental destruction of part of the forest were a blur of newfound power and self-discovery. His training intensified with each passing day, as he pushed himself to the limits to harness the dark chakra within him. What had once been foreign and terrifying was now a part of his very being, an extension of his will. With each session, his speed increased, his strength grew, and he could summon destructive shock waves with the merest flick of his hand. It was as though the very air around him bent to his will, and his senses sharpened, far beyond what any normal ninja could ever hope to achieve. But with this power came a price. Naruto's body was still adjusting to the intensity of the dark chakra that now ran through his veins, and his emotions, too, were spiraling out of control. Where he had once been impulsive, now there was a simmering anger that lay just beneath the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. His temper was shorter, his patience non-existent, and the drive to prove himself had mutated into an insatiable hunger for recognition and dominance. His mind, once a wellspring of hope, was clouded with the whispers of Zerth, coaxing him into believing that power was the only truth, that respect could only be earned through fear. The most noticeable change, however, was in his interactions with his friends, or what was left of them. Sakura had noticed it first. She had been worried for Naruto ever since the incident in the forest, where he had barely been able to control the outburst of dark energy that had shattered the landscape. At first, she had chalked it up to his usual brashness, but as time wore on, the differences became too glaring to ignore. He had become more aggressive, snapping at her for the smallest things, and there were times when she could see something dangerous flickering in his eyes, something cold and distant. Sasuke had always been the aloof one, but even he couldn't deny the change in Naruto. He didn't say much about it, but the way he tensed when Naruto was near, the subtle wariness in his gaze, spoke volumes. Sasuke wasn't a fool. He could see that Naruto was no longer the same person who had once been his loud, boisterous, and overly ambitious friend. Now, there was something darker in Naruto's aura, something that unsettled him. It came to a head during his sparring session one afternoon. Sasuke had agreed to face Naruto in the training grounds, though he hadn't been thrilled about it. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but it certainly wasn't the overwhelming force that Naruto unleashed on him. The battle started like any other, Naruto grinning widely, eager to test his skills against Sasuke's. But the moment they clashed, something inside Naruto snapped. His chakras surged uncontrollably, and the dark power within him exploded outward in a violent surge. It wasn't just chakra, it was pure, raw energy, a force of destruction that seemed to warp the very air around him. The ground trembled as the shock waves radiated from Naruto's fists. Sasuke was forced to dodge, narrowly escaping a devastating blow that would have obliterated him. "Naruto, stop!" Sakura shouted from the sidelines, her voice filled with panic. But Naruto didn't hear her, or perhaps, he didn't care. His eyes glowed with an intensity that sent shivers down Sasuke's spine, his every move calculated with terrifying precision. He struck out again, the force of his punch creating a massive crater in the ground. Sasuke barely managed to evade, but in his haste, he slipped, and that was all Naruto needed. The next moment, Sasuke found himself pinned to the ground by an explosion of chakra, unable to move. The look in Naruto's eyes was chilling, the warmth and friendliness replaced with cold calculation. "I don't need your pity, Sasuke," Naruto sneered, his voice distorted by the dark chakra that swirled around him. "You and everyone else are just obstacles in my way." With that, Naruto slammed his fist into the ground, sending a shockwave that threw Sasuke several feet away. The attack left Sasuke bruised and disoriented, a look of fear in his eyes. The Naruto he knew was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. It was then that Sasuke realized the truth. Naruto was becoming something he couldn't control. The village, too, began to notice the shift. Whispers spread quickly, carried on the winds of suspicion and fear. The elders of the village convened, debating what to do about the increasingly erratic and violent behavior of the young Jinchuriki. There was talk of sealing Naruto away, of removing him from the village before his destructive potential could spiral out of control. The sight of Naruto's raw power, coupled with his unstable emotions, was enough to convince many that he was a threat to the very existence of Konoha. The Umbu were dispatched to keep an eye on Naruto, but they were not the only ones watching him. In the shadows, a figure stirred. Jiraiya, the legendary Sannin, had been summoned to evaluate Naruto's growing power. The Hokage had hoped that Jiraiya's wisdom and experience could offer some insight into the situation, but deep down, Hiruzen knew the truth. Naruto was no longer the child he had once known. He was changing, and not for the better. The dark power within him was threatening to consume him entirely, and it was only a matter of time before that power turned on the village. Jiraiya's arrival was imminent, but Naruto had already sensed the coming storm. As his training in the dark chakra progressed, the whispers of Zerth grew louder, urging him to break free from the shackles of Konoha, to embrace his true nature and leave the village behind. One night, while sneaking through the village to continue his training, Naruto overheard a conversation between two village elders. They spoke in hushed tones, unaware that Naruto had crept up nearby. "The boy is becoming too dangerous," one of the elders said, his voice filled with concern. "We need to seal him away before he becomes a true threat to the village. The darkness within him is growing." "But can we control it?" the other elder asked, sounding dubious. "We may be able to subdue him, but the power he wields, it's unlike anything we've ever seen. If we try to contain it, he could lash out. Then we must act quickly. Jiraiya will be here soon, but he's too late. The boy has already made his choice." Naruto's blood ran cold as he listened to their words. He had been nothing more than a tool to them, a weapon, a potential threat to their precious village. They were planning to seal him away, just like they had sealed the nine tails within him all those years ago. Betrayed again, Naruto thought, a bitter taste filling his mouth. They were just like everyone else, using him, fearing him, treating him as something to be controlled. But he was done with being controlled. Without a second thought, Naruto turned and fled into the night, disappearing into the shadows of the village. Zerth's whispers guided him, telling him to head beyond the borders of the Land of Fire, to a hidden sanctuary where he could train and unlock the full extent of his power. It was a place of darkness, a place where the demons of the past had once gathered, and it called to Naruto like a siren's song. As he crossed the village's borders and ventured into the wilds, Naruto could feel the weight of his decision. There was no going back. He was leaving behind everything he had known, including the only bonds he had ever formed: Sakura, Sasuke, even the Hokage. But in his heart, Naruto felt something stirring, a feeling of freedom that he had never known before. This was his path, and he was going to walk it alone. Meanwhile, far from the Land of Fire, the shadows were shifting. Orochimaru, ever the opportunist, had taken notice of Naruto's transformation. He saw potential in the young Jinchuriki, a power that could be useful to his own dark ambitions. The Akatsuki, too, had begun to circle, their eyes on the prize that was Naruto's power. It was only a matter of time before they would come for him. But for now, Naruto was alone, walking into the darkness, his heart set on a future of his own making. And the seeds of darkness had been sown. The world around Naruto was changing, shifting beneath his feet with every step he took into the unknown. The once familiar scent of the village, the sight of its towering walls and bustling streets, had all but faded from his memory. In its place was the eerie silence of the wilderness, the trees whispering secrets in a language he could barely comprehend. But he could hear Zerth clearly, the voice resonating in his mind like a deep, soothing murmur that drowned out everything else. The path ahead was dark, twisted, but it felt more like home than Konoha ever had. Guided by the whispers, Naruto wandered through the dense forest, each step taking him deeper into uncharted territory. He had no map, no guide, only the haunting promise of power. Zerth had spoken of ancient ruins, a place where his followers had once gathered, now abandoned and long forgotten by the world. It was there, in the heart of this cursed forest, that Naruto would find the answers he sought. The journey was grueling. The thick underbrush and towering trees blocked his way, their twisted roots and branches seeming to fight against him. But Naruto pressed on, his resolve hardening with every passing moment. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back now. Days passed, and his strength grew, not just in his body, but in his mind. He had always been determined, but now he was becoming something else, something more. His chakras surged with an intensity that threatened to tear him apart, but he could feel Zerth's influence, guiding him, teaching him how to control it. The dark energy was intoxicating, addictive even, and Naruto began to crave more. It was during the fourth night of his journey, when the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the forest, that he stumbled upon the ruins. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The stone structures were ancient, crumbled by time but still holding an eerie, malevolent presence. Vines clung to the walls like serpents, and strange symbols were etched into the stones, glowing faintly in the moonlight. As Naruto stepped closer, he could feel the air grow thick with power. It wasn't just chakra, it was something older, darker, something that had been sealed away for centuries. Zerth's voice grew louder in his mind. "You found it, Naruto. The altar awaits you. There, you will unlock the true extent of your power." Without hesitation, Naruto entered the ruins, navigating through the winding corridors, his senses heightened. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound echoed in his ears, but he wasn't afraid. He was ready. Finally, he reached the heart of the ruins, a massive chamber with an altar at its center. The air was heavy with an oppressive force, and the ground was littered with shattered remnants of what seemed like broken chains. As Naruto approached the altar, the atmosphere shifted. The darkness thickened, swirling around him like a living entity, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to fall silent. Then, it happened. The ground trembled, and from the very stone beneath Naruto's feet, a figure began to materialize. It was a shadow, an amalgamation of darkness and power, shifting and writhing like smoke. As it took form, Naruto could make out a face. Its eyes glowed crimson, just like his own would soon do. It was Zerth, but not in full form. This was merely a projection, a fraction of his true self. "You have come," Zerth's voice echoed in Naruto's mind, deep and resonant. "You have shown the strength of your will, and now I shall grant you the power to shape the world in your image." Naruto's heart raced, his pulse quickening as he stepped forward. "I'm ready," he said, his voice filled with determination. He had long ago cast aside any doubts, and now, he sought only power. Zerth's essence loomed over him, a dark, oppressive presence that seemed to stretch across the chamber. "I can give you more than you've ever imagined, Naruto. In exchange, you must submit to me. Your body, your soul, all will be mine to command. But through me, you will possess abilities beyond your comprehension. You will wield the power of the demon kings themselves." Naruto hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. But in the end, the hunger for power, the desire to make the world see him, to make them all bow before him, overcame any lingering doubts. He wanted to be unstoppable, to control his own fate. He would not let the village, or anyone else, dictate his life ever again. "I accept," he said, his voice steady and resolute. With that, Zerth's essence surged forward, a flood of darkness that poured into Naruto's body. His vision blurred as the power coursed through him, a force like nothing he had ever felt before. The world around him seemed to twist and distort as his body was remade, reshaped by the dark energy. His veins burned with raw chakra, and his skin tingled as dark markings began to spread across his arms, his chest, his face. The transformation was both excruciating and exhilarating. Pain seared through Naruto's body, but it was a pain he welcomed, a sign that he was becoming something greater, something more. And when the process finally subsided, he stood there, trembling but triumphant. His eyes glowed a deep, crimson red, the markings on his skin pulsing with dark energy. Naruto could feel the power within him, thrumming like a living thing. He was stronger than ever before, stronger than anything he had ever imagined. He could feel the presence of the monstrous creatures Zerth had promised him, creatures that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for his command. His senses had sharpened to an almost terrifying degree, and his mind had been flooded with new knowledge, ancient techniques, forbidden jutsu that could tear through the very fabric of reality itself. With a flick of his wrist, Naruto summoned a dark blade, a weapon forged from pure energy, crackling with dark lightning. He swung it through the air, and the blade left a trail of destruction in its wake, cutting through stone and tree alike as if they were nothing more than paper. This was power. True power. And it was his. But as the weight of the transformation settled in, Naruto couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something was still holding him back. Despite his newfound strength, he was still bound by the chains of his past, by the village that had rejected him, by the people who had never seen him as more than a tool. He had to break free. He had to make them all understand that he was no longer the lonely, forgotten child. He was a force of nature now. His thoughts were interrupted as Zerth's voice echoed in his mind once more. The path ahead is yours to choose, Naruto. But remember, power comes at a cost. The more you embrace the darkness, the more you will lose of yourself. But in return, you will gain a power that no one can rival. Naruto's eyes narrowed. He had already made his choice. He was no longer bound by anyone's expectations. He was free to carve his own path, and no one would stand in his way. News of Naruto's disappearance spread quickly through Konoha. Whispers of his defection reached the Hokage stairs, and the village was thrown into chaos. Teams were dispatched to track him down, but none were prepared for the full extent of his power. The first few squads sent to capture him were overwhelmed with ease. Those who survived spread word of Naruto's monstrous strength, fueling the growing fear that the village had unleashed something far beyond their control. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Orochimaru stirred. The former Chunin had been watching Naruto's progress from afar, and he recognized the potential in the young rogue ninja. Naruto was an asset, an incredibly powerful one, and Orochimaru saw an opportunity to use him for his own purposes. He dispatched his own spies to track Naruto, hoping to recruit him for his ever-expanding ambitions. And then, there were the Akatsuki. The organization had long been interested in Naruto, though not for the reasons most assumed. His power had always been a draw, but now, with Zerth's influence coursing through him, he had become an even more valuable asset. They too would soon come for him, each member eyeing him as a potential ally or a tool to further their own ends. But for now, Naruto was alone, walking a path that only he could see, surrounded by darkness and the promise of limitless power. He had crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back. And as the world outside Konoha trembled, Naruto stepped further into the abyss, ready to claim the world that had rejected him. The world had long since forgotten the innocent child who had once wandered the streets of Konoha, seeking recognition and warmth. That Naruto was gone, consumed by the power he had embraced, by the darkness that now thrummed in his veins. The transformation was not just physical, it was a change of the soul, a reimagining of who he was and what he stood for. Now, he was the King of Shadows, a name whispered with fear and reverence across the lands. Naruto's rise was swift, his power undeniable. He had forged an army, one made up of the broken and the lost rogue ninjas who had abandoned their villages, outcasts who had no place in the world, and cultists who had worshipped Zerth as a god long before Naruto had even known of him. Together, they rallied behind the young man who was now their king. They called him the Shadow King, the harbinger of a new era. And though Naruto had given himself to the darkness, he felt more alive than ever. In the heart of his new domain, a secluded fortress hidden deep within a forsaken land, Naruto stood in the center of a vast chamber, gazing at the reflection of his altered form. His skin was marked with runes of black energy, his eyes glowing a sinister crimson. His once blonde hair had darkened, and his features had become sharp, regal, almost otherworldly. The person staring back at him in the mirror was unrecognizable, yet it was him, the same Naruto who had once dreamed of becoming Hokage, a being acknowledged by everyone. Now, that dream felt laughable. "You've come far," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Turning, Naruto's gaze settled on a tall, slender woman who stood in the doorway. Her long, raven black hair framed a face as pale as porcelain, and her eyes, dark as the abyss, held an ancient wisdom. This was Rika, Zerth's high priestess. She had been his guide through the dark arts, helping him unlock the full potential of the power coursing through him. "Rika," Naruto said, his voice deep and steady. "How much further must I go? What more can I become?" Rika stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Power has no limits, my ken. But you must learn to control it, to master the dark forces that are now part of you. You are more than just a weapon, you are the one who will reshape the world." Naruto's lips curled into a smile, but there was no joy in it, only a cold, calculating ambition. "The world will bend to my will. I will make them all see. They'll understand that I am the one who will lead, the one who will destroy the old order and create something new." Rika nodded, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "As you command, my king." Naruto's thoughts were interrupted by the low rumble of his growing army, the sound of clashing metal and the cries of battle that echoed from beyond the walls of the fortress. He had become a king, but kings needed to prove their worth. And Naruto was eager to show the world just how far his power could reach. Outside, his followers were preparing for their next raid, another village to be destroyed, another demonstration of the King of Shadows' might. They had already taken down several smaller, lesser villages, each one a testament to Naruto's growing power. He had become a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. But there was one person who could not let go of the past, one person who refused to believe that Naruto had truly fallen into darkness. Hinata's heart was shattered the moment Naruto had disappeared from Konoha. She had felt his absence keenly, the sense of loss weighing on her like 1,000 pounds. She had never been able to understand Naruto fully, why he acted the way he did, why he pushed others away. But despite everything, she loved him. And now, he was gone, lost to something darker, something dangerous. She couldn't sit idle, couldn't pretend that everything was okay. Hinata had always been a quiet, passive soul, content to watch from the sidelines, to quietly support those she cared for. But this was different. This was Naruto, and she couldn't lose him to the darkness. So, in secret, she left Konoha. No one knew where she had gone, not even her own family. She ventured into the wilds, following the whispers of the wind, hoping to find a trace of Naruto. She had to find him, to bring him back, to remind him of who he once was. Days turned into weeks as Hinata searched relentlessly. She had learned enough to track Naruto's movements, to follow the signs of destruction that marked his path. The devastation he left behind was unmistakable: burned villages, broken lands, shattered lives. But as she ventured deeper into the territories he had claimed, the sight of his twisted creations only fueled her resolve. She couldn't stop now. She had to find him. It was on the edge of a ruined village that she finally found him. Naruto stood in the center of the wreckage, his crimson eyes glowing in the fading light of dusk. His dark cloak billowed behind him, a figure of power and menace. He was no longer the boy she had once known. This Naruto was a king, a ruler of shadows, a being beyond human comprehension. "Hinata." Naruto's voice was cold, distant, almost unfamiliar. He didn't even turn to face her as she approached. "What are you doing here?" Hinata's heart clenched. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she steeled herself. "I came to bring you back, Naruto." You don't have to do this. You're not a monster. Naruto finally turned to face her, his crimson eyes locking onto hers. A flicker of recognition passed through them, but it was quickly replaced by something darker. A monster, huh? He said with a humorless laugh. Maybe I am. But it's too late for me, Hinata. It's too late for anyone who dares stand against me. You're still Naruto, Hinata said, stepping closer, her hands trembling. I know you are. I know you haven't lost yourself completely. I won't give up on you. Naruto's gaze hardened, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he looked like the old Naruto, the one she had known. But then the darkness crept back into his features, and he took a step back. No, Hinata. You don't understand. I'm beyond that now. I don't need saving. I never did. You should leave before I won't leave, she interrupted, her voice fierce now. I will stand by you, no matter what. Even if you won't admit it, I know you still care. You haven't lost everything. Naruto's face twisted in conflict for a moment, but the darkness within him spoke louder than the remnants of his past. You're a fool, he snarled. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Leave now, or I'll make you. Hinata didn't flinch. I won't leave you, Naruto. I'm here, and I always will be. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of their words hanging between them. Naruto's fists clenched, and for an instant, Hinata thought he might strike her, that he might finally give in to the overwhelming force of the darkness inside him. But then, with a bitter laugh, he turned away, his back to her. You're wasting your time, Naruto said, his voice barely a whisper. I've already made my choice. Hinata's heart broke, but she didn't give up. I don't care about your choice. I care about you, Naruto. And I won't stop fighting for you. Naruto's crimson eyes flickered with something unspoken, but he said nothing more. As Hinata stood there, watching the man she loved walk further into the abyss, she knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, that the Naruto she had known might never come back. But she would not give up. Not now. Not ever. Meanwhile, Naruto had already begun to make his mark on the world. His raids on neighboring villages had grown more brutal, more destructive. Each village he conquered was another step toward his goal of creating a world where only he would rule, where no one could challenge his authority. The world's shinobi alliance began to take notice, marking Naruto as a global threat. But the attention of others was of little consequence to him. He had no need for alliances. No need for others. He would create his own kingdom, built on power, on strength, and on his will alone. And yet, in the shadows, other forces watched with interest Orochimaru and the Akatsuki. They saw Naruto as a potential ally, someone who could be molded into a weapon, someone who could serve their needs. But Naruto had other plans. He was beyond their petty schemes, beyond their manipulations. I don't need anyone, he muttered to himself, his eyes glowing as he stood atop the ruins of a fallen village. This world will bow to me. I'll make them all understand. And as Zerth's laughter echoed in his mind, Naruto felt a surge of power, an overwhelming sense of purpose. He had become the king of shadows, and the world would tremble before him. Naruto's transformation was complete. The innocent boy who had once yearned for the approval of his village had long since been swallowed by the shadows, leaving behind only the Shadow King. His name struck fear into the hearts of those who heard it, an unstoppable force, a tyrant who waged war on the world, leaving destruction in his wake. The fortress he had built from the ruins of Zerth's ancient prison stood as a symbol of his newfound power. Dark chakra seals covered its walls, each one infused with the essence of Zerth. The seals were not just a defense, they were a statement. Here, in this forsaken land, the Shadow King would rise, and no one would challenge his reign. His army, once a collection of misfits and outcasts, had grown into a well-trained, deadly force. Naruto had taken it upon himself to teach them the forbidden techniques Zerth had imparted to him. His followers, eager for the power that Naruto promised them, had embraced the darkness, mastering techniques that defied the laws of nature. They became extensions of his will, mindless instruments of destruction until Naruto made them something more. He trained them to be powerful, cunning, and loyal. His shadow spread far and wide, reaching even the most remote corners of the world. In the distance, his forces launched raids on neighboring villages, taking what they wanted and leaving only ruin behind. The once proud villages, with their well-established shinobi forces, crumbled before Naruto's might. Their resistance was crushed effortlessly, and the leaders of these villages were either subjugated or killed. No one could stand against the Shadow King. Yet, despite his success, Naruto's world felt increasingly isolated. He had once believed that power would give him the recognition and respect he craved, but now, it seemed hollow. His followers revered him, but they feared him too. His power was absolute, but his kingdom was built on ashes. Hinata, meanwhile, had not given up on him. After the confrontation in the ruined village, she had tried to track Naruto down. She couldn't abandon him, not after everything they had been through. Despite the darkness that surrounded him, she believed there was still a part of him that was the Naruto she had loved. She had found him, but the man she had encountered was not the same Naruto she had known. The warmth in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. The man who had once fought for the people he loved was now a ruler, building an empire of shadows. Hinata had hoped for a miracle, but what she found was far from it. Naruto had turned away from her, dismissing her concerns with words that cut deeper than any blade. "This is the world I'm creating, Hinata," he had said. "A world where no one is powerless. No one will be abandoned. I will make them all strong." She had pleaded with him, begged him to stop his conquest, to remember who he had once been. But he was beyond reason, beyond redemption in her eyes. The Shadow King was all that remained. And yet, beneath the cold exterior, there was a flicker of humanity that even Naruto couldn't extinguish. When rogue ninja, those who opposed his rule, attempted to assassinate Hinata, Naruto had intervened. Without hesitation, he had torn through the attackers with dark energy that scorched the earth around him. His crimson eyes had glowed as he turned to face her, and for a moment, there was a brief flash of recognition. He had saved her, but not for the reasons she hoped. He had done it because, deep down, there was still something left of the boy who had once cared. "You should leave," he had said, his voice hollow. "This world is no place for you." Hinata had refused to leave, standing firm in the face of his growing darkness. "I won't give up on you," she had said, her voice unwavering. Naruto had looked at her with cold eyes, his hand trembling at his side. But instead of pushing her away, as he had done so many times before, he had turned away, walking into the depths of his fortress, leaving her behind. She hadn't followed. Not yet. Hinata knew that Naruto was slipping further into the abyss, but she couldn't let him go. No matter how dark he became, she couldn't abandon him. She would stay by his side, even if he rejected her. The world around Naruto was changing. His name was becoming infamous. The villages that had once stood as pillars of strength now crumbled before his might. The Shinobi Alliance had begun to notice. They called him a global threat, an abomination that needed to be stopped before his power could spread further. But even as the world sought to unite against him, Naruto was not without challengers. The Akatsuki, the organization of rogue ninjas, had been watching him closely. They saw his power as a tool to further their own goals, but they also saw the danger he posed. If left unchecked, Naruto would become too powerful, too unpredictable. The Akatsuki would need to test him, to see if they could control him or if they would have to eliminate him. Deidara and Kisame were dispatched to confront the Shadow King. Deidara, with his mastery over explosive clay, and Kisame, with his massive sword and mastery of water-based jutsu, were formidable opponents. They were sent not only to challenge Naruto's power but also to gauge his true strength. Naruto sensed them before they even arrived. His heightened senses, sharpened by the dark powers he had embraced, alerted him to their presence. He knew that the Akatsuki would come eventually. He had prepared for this day, though he had no intention of joining them. He was the Shadow King, and no one could control him. The battle took place in the heart of his territory, near the base of his fortress. Deidara soared through the air, his clay birds flying high above, while Kisame stood at the ready, his shark-like features barely visible beneath his cloak. Naruto stood alone, his crimson eyes glowing as dark energy swirled around him. He didn't need words. He didn't need to explain himself. He simply unleashed the power that Zerth had granted him. A wave of dark energy erupted from his body, sending shock waves through the land. Deidara's clay bombs were consumed by the dark flames before they could even explode, disintegrating into nothingness. The force of the blast shattered the ground beneath their feet, sending Deidara's clay birds spiraling into the air, falling in pieces. Kisame moved quickly, drawing his sword and slashing through the air with brutal precision. But Naruto's power was too overwhelming. Dark energy coiled around Kisame's movements, slowing him down, binding him in place. Naruto's eyes gleamed with amusement as Kisame struggled against the dark forces that held him. Is this the best the Akatsuki has to offer? Naruto asked, his voice cold and commanding. Kisame gritted his teeth, trying to break free, but it was futile. With a single movement, Naruto unleashed another blast of dark energy, forcing Kisame to retreat. The shark-faced man's form disappeared into the shadows, vanishing from the battlefield. Deidara, seeing that his partner had been forced to flee, hesitated for a moment before retreating as well. Naruto stood in the center of the battlefield, his crimson eyes flickering with the promise of more destruction to come. The Akatsuki had learned a valuable lesson that day. They were not prepared for the might of the Shadow King. As the two rogue ninjas retreated, Naruto's attention shifted once more to his growing empire. His conquest would not be stopped. He had already proven his strength, and now, he would show the world what it meant to challenge him. But there was still one more threat on the horizon: Orochimaru. The former Konoha shinobi, now a creature of insatiable ambition, had his sights set on Naruto. Orochimaru saw the potential in Naruto, saw a weapon that could be shaped to serve his own purposes. But he also knew that Naruto would never submit to anyone. Orochimaru, ever the manipulator, had already begun to plant seeds of doubt in Sasuke's mind. He told Sasuke that Naruto had become a monster, a threat that could not be allowed to live. Sasuke, consumed by his desire for revenge, would become the next piece in Orochimaru's twisted game. Naruto knew that Sasuke was coming for him. He could feel the pull of his former friend, the weight of their shared history. But he would not be swayed. Sasuke's path was one of vengeance, and Naruto's path was one of domination. They would meet again, but this time, Naruto would be the one to decide the fate of their rivalry. The Shadow King's reign had only just begun. Naruto stood atop the crumbling remnants of his fortress, looking out over the land he had conquered. His eyes glowed a deep crimson, reflecting the unrelenting power coursing through him. The once feeling boy who had craved acceptance was now a shadow of his former self, ruled by the dark influence of Zerth. With every passing day, the voice of Zerth grew stronger, whispering promises of immortality and an empire built on the bones of those who had wronged him. The shadows, both literal and metaphorical, had become his closest allies. He had forsaken everything: the village, the bonds he once cherished, and the person he had been. All that remained was the Shadow King, a being of unmatched power who commanded fear and respect from every corner of the world. But there was still a lingering presence in his life, a tether to his humanity. Hinata. Despite the cold distance Naruto had put between them, she refused to give up on him. She believed there was still something of the Naruto she had once known buried beneath the darkness. She tried, time and again, to reach him, to pull him back from the precipice. But the deeper he sank into the abyss, the harder it became for him to care. Hinata stood at the edge of his fortress, her heart heavy with the weight of the man she loved. She had seen the changes, felt the shift in his very being. She knew that the Naruto she had once loved was slipping away, but she refused to abandon him. She couldn't. No matter how dark he became, she still believed in the boy he had been. Naruto turned away from the horizon, his crimson eyes narrowing as he sensed the approach of the task force Konoha had sent to stop him. Tsunade, desperate to rid the world of the threat he had become, had assembled a team of Konoha's finest shinobi to deal with him once and for all. Kakashi, Jiraiya, and Yamato, veterans of countless battles, would lead the mission. Alongside them were Sakura and Sasuke, both torn between their loyalties to the village and their shared past with Naruto. Naruto had spies everywhere, his influence spreading far and wide. He knew they were coming. He could feel the tension building in the air, the anticipation of the final confrontation. This wasn't just a battle for survival, this was a battle for his very soul. Zerth's influence had a hold on him, and the temptation to embrace the power the dark entity offered was almost too much to resist. Zerth's voice echoed in his mind. You have the power to crush them all, Naruto. You have the power to rule the world. Do not hesitate. Do not falter. Embrace me fully, and together, we will make this world our own. Naruto clenched his fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands. He knew that Zerth was right. He could feel the power coursing through him, the darkness that had transformed him into something unrecognizable. But as his power grew, so did the nagging voice in the back of his mind, the voice of the boy he once was. It told him that there had to be something left, that he couldn't lose himself completely. Hinata's voice broke through the storm of his thoughts, soft and pleading. Naruto, please. Come back to me. But Naruto didn't respond. He couldn't. The distance between them had grown too wide, the darkness too deep. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. His heart, once full of hope and warmth, had been consumed by the shadows. The task force arrived in full force, their presence like a storm on the horizon. Kakashi's sharp eye scanned the landscape, taking in the fortress and the defenses Naruto had set in place. He knew this would be a fight unlike any they had faced before. He knew that Naruto had changed irreparably so. The boy who had once been their comrade was now their enemy. Sakura's heart ached as she thought of Naruto, the boy she had once considered a brother. She couldn't bring herself to hate him, even now, even after everything he had done. She could still see the glimmers of the boy she had once cared for, buried beneath the darkness. Sasuke, on the other hand, was a different story. His hatred for Naruto burned brighter than ever. The betrayal he had felt when Naruto left the village was still fresh in his mind. The pain of being abandoned, of watching his brotherhood with Naruto dissolve into nothingness, was something he could never forgive. The tension between the members of the task force was palpable as they approached the gates of Naruto's fortress. Jiraiya, despite the years and experience he had gained, couldn't help but feel a deep sorrow. He had known Naruto since he was a child, had watched him grow from a mischievous prankster to a promising shinobi. To see him fall so far, to see him become the very thing they had once fought against, broke something inside Jiraiya. He wasn't sure if Naruto could ever be saved, but he would try. For the boy who had once been his student. The battle began the moment they crossed the threshold of the fortress. Naruto's generals, each a terrifying reflection of the power he had gained, met Konoha's shinobi head-on. These generals were not mere soldiers. They were transformed by Naruto's dark influence, their bodies and minds warped by the power of Zerth. Kakashi, ever the tactician, led the charge. His Sharingan flickered to life as he analyzed the situation, his mind racing with strategies. He knew they had to get to Naruto, but that would be no easy task. The fortress was filled with traps, and Naruto's followers were relentless. Every step they took was met with resistance. Jiraiya, Yamato, and the others fought valiantly, each taking on a different general, their battles fierce and unyielding. But it was Naruto they sought. It was Naruto they needed to confront. Finally, Jiraiya reached the inner sanctum, where Naruto awaited. The Shadow King stood at the center of the room, his crimson eyes glowing with malevolent power. Zerth's influence was overwhelming, and it was clear that Naruto had embraced it fully. He was no longer the boy they had once known. Jiraiya stepped forward, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. "Naruto," he began, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I know you can hear me. You don't have to do this. You don't have to walk this path." Naruto's eyes flickered briefly, and for a moment, it seemed as though the boy he had once been might resurface. But then Zerth's voice echoed in his mind, drowning out Jiraiya's words. "He is weak. He cannot save you. Only I can offer you true power, true immortality." Naruto's expression hardened. He turned toward Jiraiya, his eyes glowing with the full fury of Zerth's power. "I don't need saving," he said, his voice cold and distant. "I have everything I need. I built an empire, and I will make the world kneel before me." "You're too late, Jiraiya. There is nothing left of the old me." Jiraiya's heart sank. He had known this day would come, but he had prayed that there might still be a way to reach Naruto, to pull him back from the darkness. But it was clear now that Naruto had fully embraced his new identity. He was the Shadow King, and nothing could change that. With a wave of his hand, Naruto unleashed a torrent of dark energy, slamming Jiraiya backward. The force of the blow sent him crashing into the wall, leaving him gasping for breath. Blood pooled around him, but his resolve remained. "I won't give up on you, Naruto," Jiraiya whispered, his voice strained but firm. "Even if you've lost your way, I'll always believe in you." Naruto stood over him, his crimson eyes glowing like fire. "Believe all you want," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But I've made my choice. This is the end." With that, Naruto raised his hand, preparing to deal the final blow. But before he could strike, a familiar voice broke through the air. "Stop." Hinata stood at the entrance of the room, her voice trembling but unwavering. She had come for him again, risking everything to reach the man she loved. Naruto's gaze softened for a moment as he looked at her, but then Zerth's voice whispered in his mind, urging him to strike. "She is weak, Naruto. She will only hold you back." Hinata stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears. "Naruto, please, come back to me. This isn't you. I know you're still in there. Please don't let Zerth control you." Naruto's hand faltered, the dark energy crackling in his palm. For a moment, he hesitated, the pull of his humanity warring with the darkness that had consumed him. But in the end, the darkness won. He lowered his hand, his eyes cold once more. "This is who I am now, Hinata," he said quietly. "I've made my choice." And with that, he turned away from her, leaving her standing in the ruins of what had once been his heart. Jiraiya, wounded but alive, watched as Naruto walked away, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Naruto had fallen too far to be saved. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The Shadow King had risen, and the world would tremble before him. Naruto sat in the center of his chamber, his legs crossed, eyes closed in a meditative state. The darkness around him was palpable, as if the very air was thick with the power that flowed through his veins. But there was something more, something sinister lurking just beneath the surface. It had been there since the moment he had first embraced the darkness within him, the power of Zerth. That voice, whispering in his mind, urging him to become something greater, something unstoppable. He had tried to ignore it, tried to push it away, but it had grown louder with each passing day. He had once believed that his strength was his own, that he was forging his own path. But now, every time he closed his eyes, he could feel Zerth's presence, a constant reminder that the demon's influence had taken root within him. You are nothing without me, Naruto. You are weak. Your human emotions are your chains. Cast them off, and you will be free. The voice echoed in his mind, as familiar as his own thoughts, as undeniable as his heartbeat. Zerth's promises of power, of immortality, swirled in his mind, intoxicating him. Every time he tried to focus, tried to reconnect with his humanity, the demon's presence became stronger. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch, a hunger that could never be satiated. Naruto clenched his fists, feeling the familiar rush of dark chakras swirl inside him. The chains that bound him to Zerth had tightened, and the demon was pulling him deeper into its grip. He had always prided himself on being strong, on pushing through the pain and the loneliness. But now, he wasn't sure if he could push through this. He wasn't sure if he wanted to. The vision came without warning. A sudden darkness engulfed his senses, and before him, there was only the colossal form of Zerth. The demon towered over him, a twisted, grotesque figure bound by thick chains that glowed with the dark, otherworldly light. Its eyes were pits of endless darkness, and as it spoke, its voice reverberated in Naruto's mind like the roar of 1,000 storms. You think you can control me? You are mine now, Naruto. You were always meant to be mine. Your soul, your body, everything you are, everything you will become, belongs to me. The chains rattled as the demon shifted, its immense power radiating outward, suffocating everything in its wake. Naruto could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. Embrace me, Naruto. Embrace the true power that lies within you. Together, we will annihilate your enemies. Konoha. The world. No one will stand against us. And in return, I will grant you immortality. You will never know defeat again. Naruto's heart pounded in his chest. The temptation was unbearable, the promises of power so alluring. But beneath that, a small flicker of resistance remained. The boy who had once dreamed of becoming Hokage, of earning the respect of the villagers, was still there, buried deep inside. He could feel the remnants of that dream, but they were fading fast. You cannot fight me, Naruto. You belong to me now. There is no turning back. The chain snapped, and the vision shattered, leaving Naruto breathless and trembling. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his fists clenched tighter as the words of the demon reverberated in his mind. Naruto's breathing was shallow as he opened his eyes, his body trembling from the weight of the vision. He felt sick to his stomach, a mixture of fear and anger swirling inside him. But amidst that chaos, there was something else, something he had to do. He couldn't allow himself to be consumed by Zerth. Not completely. He needed to regain control. But how? That's when Rika entered his chamber, her eyes sharp as she studied his expression. She had been one of his most trusted generals, but she was also something of an enigma, more attuned to the dark arts than most. She could see the struggle within him, the conflict between his humanity and the monstrous power he had inherited. You're losing control, Naruto, Rika said quietly, her voice filled with concern. You cannot keep fighting this alone. You need help. There's a ritual, a dark ritual that can suppress Zerth's influence. For a time, at least. Naruto's gaze flickered to her, his mind still reeling from the vision. He had never been one to rely on others, but right now, he had no choice. He was too far gone to think of any other solution. What is it? Naruto asked, his voice low and hesitant. Will it stop him? Rika nodded. It will suppress his hold over you temporarily. But it comes with a price. The ritual will amplify your power, make you more unstable. The darkness will fight back, and you'll need to be stronger than ever to survive it. It's a dangerous path, Naruto. Are you sure you want to take it? Naruto hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Zerth's whispers were still in his mind, urging him to embrace the power. The idea of becoming stronger, of crushing his enemies with an iron fist, was tempting. But deep down, he knew that if he didn't stop Zerth now, he would lose himself forever. I'll do it, Naruto said, his voice filled with determination. I can't let him win. Not now. The ritual was dark and complicated, a series of incantations and symbols drawn in blood across the stone floor. Rika guided him through it, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of caution and anticipation. As the ritual began, Naruto could feel the darkness inside him stirring, becoming restless, as if it knew what was coming. His body shook, his chakra flaring out of control as Zerth's power fought to break free. The chains that bound him to Zerth seemed to tighten with every passing second. He could hear the demon's voice, now louder and more furious than ever. You think you can suppress me, Naruto? You are mine. You always have been. But Naruto gritted his teeth and focused, pushing through the pain. He had to hold on. He had to fight. The ritual reached its climax, and for a brief moment, everything went still. A deep silence filled the air, and Naruto felt the pressure lift, the suffocating weight of Zerth's influence easing. He breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. The ritual had worked, but at a cost. The darkness had not been fully purged. It had merely been suppressed, and in doing so, Naruto's power had increased exponentially. He could feel it, surging through his veins. His chakra had grown stronger, more volatile. His senses were sharper, but his control had become more tenuous. He was now a ticking time bomb, one step away from losing himself completely. As Naruto staggered to his feet, still reeling from the ritual's after-effects, he felt the distant approach of his enemies. Konoha had come for him once again. Sasuke, Sakura, Kakashi. They were all coming to stop him. To save him, if they could. Naruto's heart raced as he steeled himself for the battle to come. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face them. He wasn't sure if he could stop himself from succumbing to the darkness. But he would fight. He would fight with everything he had left. Hinata found him just as he was preparing for the inevitable. She had been watching from a distance, her heart aching with every moment she saw Naruto slipping further away. She stepped forward, her voice trembling as she called out to him. Naruto, please. Don't do this. Don't let him win. You can still come back. Naruto turned to her, his eyes cold and distant. The struggle inside him was visible, the war between the boy he had been and the monster he was becoming. But in that moment, there was no answer. There was no way to stop what was coming. Stay out of this, Hinata, Naruto said, his voice hard and devoid of warmth. This is my battle. You're just going to get hurt. Hinata took a step forward, her eyes filled with pain. I don't care. I won't give up on you, Naruto. I can't. But Naruto pushed her away, his dark chakra flaring up, sending her stumbling backward. Weakness has no place in my world, he said, his voice cold as ice. With that, he turned away, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the person who had once been his anchor was now the one thing he could never have. The final battle was about to begin. Sasuke and his team were closing in, and Naruto was prepared to meet them head-on. But deep down, he wondered if he was still capable of feeling anything other than the cold, consuming darkness that had taken root in his soul. As the storm of war gathered around him, Naruto couldn't help but wonder, was there still a chance for redemption? Or was he already too far gone? Only time would tell. The winds howled across the blood-soaked battlefield, the once vibrant landscape now reduced to a desolate wasteland. Villages had crumbled under the weight of Naruto's ambition, and his armies, comprised of rogue ninjas, criminals, and deserters, continued to march forward. The cries of the innocent echoed through the land, but Naruto, the Demon King, remained unmoved. But beneath the cold, stone-like exterior, a storm was brewing inside him. Naruto stood at the heart of his fortress, staring out at the wreckage his forces had left behind. Smoke billowed from the remains of towns, and the skies were shrouded in a perpetual dusk. The ground beneath him was scorched, barren, and cracked. The battle was far from over, but a strange emptiness had settled in his chest, a hollowness that was becoming harder to ignore. The war had been his choice, his will to dominate, but with every victory, the weight of his actions pressed down harder on him. He had embraced Zerth's influence, believing that power through fear was the only way to reshape the world. But now, as he looked out over the ruins, the faces of the fallen haunting his thoughts, he began to question his path. Memories from his childhood resurfaced, unbidden, like a storm crashing over him. He remembered the loneliness, the isolation, the years spent longing for recognition. He had been treated as a demon, an outcast, but there had been flickers of warmth when he had believed in something greater. The bonds he once held with his friends, with his village, seemed like a distant dream now. Was this truly the world he had wanted to create? A world built on fear, where those who opposed him were crushed beneath his boot? He clenched his fists, the weight of the sword in his hand reminding him of his power, his newfound strength. But even with all the might in the world, the victory felt hollow. He had killed Gaara, a man who had once walked a similar path of pain and loneliness, and yet, even in his death, Gaara's words echoed in Naruto's mind. You don't have to be a monster. Come back. You can still save yourself. Naruto's heart twisted painfully in his chest. Zerth's voice, once a comforting whisper, had become a constant presence, driving him toward destruction. But now, that voice was beginning to feel distant. The demon's influence, though powerful, seemed less certain than before. Is this really what I want? Naruto muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper, as though asking the very air to answer him. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of something familiar. The distant memory of Hinata's scent, her gentle voice, reached him through the haze of his thoughts. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, he could almost feel her presence beside him. Her plea to stop, to turn away from the darkness, echoed in his mind. Please, Naruto. I won't leave you. You don't have to do this. You don't have to destroy everything. The memory of her words, of her love, tugged at him, a lifeline in the midst of his turmoil. But just as quickly as the warmth of her voice had enveloped him, it was replaced by the cold, mocking laughter of Zerth. You're weak, the demon's voice rumbled in his mind, its dark resonance echoing through every fiber of his being. You always were. This doubt, this hesitation, it makes you weak. You're nothing without me, Naruto. Without me, you're just a boy with no future, no purpose. Naruto's mind recoiled from the demon's words, but there was a part of him that couldn't shake the truth. Without Zerth's power, he would have nothing. Without this darkness, this rage, he would be nothing more than the lonely, helpless child he had once been. He had suffered so much, and now he had the power to make the world kneel before him. How could he give it up? How could he let go of the one thing that had finally given him control? But another part of him, something deep inside, buried beneath the demon's influence, rebelled. No, Naruto thought, clenching his fists tightly. I'm not weak. I can still fight. I won't let you control me. Zerth's laughter grew louder, mocking, as the chains that bound Naruto's mind tightened. Naruto's vision blurred as the landscape around him began to shift. The walls of his fortress dissolved, replaced by an infernal expanse of fire and shadows. The ground trembled beneath his feet as the very fabric of his reality began to unravel. And there, standing before him in the center of the chaos, was Zerth. The demon stood tall, his form a hulking mass of dark energy, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire. The chains that bound him to Naruto's soul rattled ominously, their presence like a weight pressing down on Naruto's chest. Zerth's mocking smile stretched across his face, and his voice filled the air with a chilling calm. "You've always been weak, Naruto," Zerth sneered. "I gave you the power to reshape the world, to make your enemies bow before you. And yet here you stand, questioning it all. I have to admit, I'm disappointed." Naruto's legs shook with the weight of the demon's gaze, but he refused to falter. "I'm not the same as you. I'm not like you." Zerth's laugh rang out, cruel and mocking. "Oh, but you are. You always have been. I am your power, your strength. Without me, you are nothing. You're just a frightened child, terrified of facing the truth. The truth that you are mine." The chains that bound Zerth clattered in unison, and the ground beneath Naruto's feet seemed to shake with the force of the demon's words. Zerth's form seemed to expand, growing ever larger as he loomed over Naruto, his dark energy suffocating. Naruto staggered backward, but his resolve remained firm. "I won't give up," he whispered, though doubt gnawed at his heart. "I'll fight. I will break these chains." Zerth's eyes flared with fury. "You can't break free, Naruto. You are mine. I have already consumed your soul, and now you will serve me as a vessel. I will be reborn, and the world will tremble before my power." But even as Zerth's words washed over him, another voice broke through the darkness. It was soft at first, a whisper in the chaos, but it grew louder with every passing second. "Please. Naruto, don't give up." Hinata's voice, fragile yet full of love, echoed in his mind. Her words filled him with warmth, her faith in him a beacon in the darkness. "Hinata." Naruto thought, his heart aching. I can't let you down. I won't." With that thought, a surge of determination coursed through Naruto's body. He fought against the chains that bound him, pulling at them with every ounce of strength he had left. The fire that had once consumed him now burned with a new intensity, a fire not of rage, but of defiance. He would not be a pawn. He would not let Zerth consume him. Naruto reached out, tearing at the chains that held him in place. Each link he broke filled him with more strength, more clarity. Zerth screamed in frustration as Naruto's power surged, and the chains began to crack and shatter. "No!" Zerth howled, his form flickering as Naruto's resolve shattered the demon's grip. With one final, powerful push, Naruto severed the last of the chains that bound him. The fire and shadows receded, and the landscape of his mind returned to a semblance of peace. Naruto stood, breathing heavily, sweat trickling down his brow. He had won. For now. But the victory was bittersweet. The darkness still lingered at the edges of his mind, Zerth's presence like a shadow that refused to fade. And though Naruto had reclaimed control, the doubt still gnawed at him. Could he truly escape the chains that held him? Could he ever return to the man he once was? The moment of clarity was fleeting. Naruto awoke, his body weak, his spirit drained. His mind swirled with confusion, but there was a new determination within him. He had fought back against Zerth's influence, but he knew the battle was far from over. As if in response to his vulnerability, the Shinobi Alliance launched their final assault on his fortress. The forces of Konoha, led by Tsunade, Jiraiya, and Kakashi, had arrived at the gates of his stronghold. Their armies clashed against his, and the ground trembled with the force of the oncoming war. Naruto stood at the peak of his ruined fortress, gazing down at the approaching forces. His heart was heavy with the weight of his actions, but there was no turning back now. He had made his choice. This was his final stand. The battle was about to begin. The sky above the land of shadows was an ominous, swirling mass of dark clouds, heavy with the promise of war. The once imposing fortress that had stood as a symbol of power and invincibility now trembled beneath the weight of the Shinobi Alliance's assault. The ground rumbled as armies clashed, the violent reverberation sending tremors throughout the landscape. The once pristine land was now a battleground, torn asunder by the violent clash of forces. Naruto sat upon his throne, his back straight, eyes fixed on the battlefield below, the very earth beneath his feet vibrating with the force of the war raging outside his stronghold. His body radiated dark energy, his demonic aura flaring as though it was a living thing, thrashing around him in waves. The scent of blood and destruction filled the air, but it hardly registered to him anymore. His mind was elsewhere, entangled in the chaos of his thoughts. His armies, a monstrous amalgamation of rogue ninjas, outlaws, and powerful demons, fiercely defended their stronghold. Huge, hulking beasts of shadow and flame clashed with summoned toads, snakes, and slugs from the Shinobi Alliance. The air was thick with the stench of battle crushing, unrelenting, and yet, Naruto remained unmoved. He had seen countless battles in his rise to power, had watched entire armies fall at his feet, but now, in this moment, he found himself strangely distant from the violence that raged around him. His eyes glazed over, contemplating the nature of his current existence. He had come so far, had embraced the darkness within him, and yet, in this moment, something was amiss. His heart, once brimming with the desire to prove himself, now beat erratically, as though questioning the very purpose of the path he had chosen. The thrill of battle no longer excited him the way it once had. The force of Zerth's power inside him, once a source of dominance, now seemed like a cold, empty thing. He was surrounded by his victories, but they felt hollow. His empire was vast, but the price he had paid to build it was too high. His gaze drifted downward to the battlefield again, where his monstrous beasts wreaked havoc among the enemy ranks. The Shinobi Alliance had launched a full-scale siege on his fortress, their combined might no match for the dark forces he commanded. But even with all this power, Naruto could not quell the feeling gnawing at him, the feeling that something was slipping away, something important, like a thread slowly unraveling. The weight of his decisions, the destruction he had caused, hung heavy on his shoulders. His mind was a battlefield in itself. Every victory, every conquest, had come with a price, and now, standing at the precipice of it all, he wondered if it had all been worth it. "You're hesitating," Zerth's voice rumbled from within him, the demon's influence seeping into his every thought. "Don't let them sway you. You're a king now, Naruto. You've earned your place. Don't let them take it from you." Naruto's eyes hardened as the demon's words settled in his mind. He had fought for this power, had bled for it. Zerth had promised him strength beyond measure, freedom from the constraints that had bound him in his earlier life. With a simple thought, he had torn through entire villages, crushed the resistance, and decimated any who stood in his way. The world had bowed to him. But now, the demon's voice was a constant reminder of the price he had paid. He clenched his fists, the sharp sensation of his nails biting into his palm bringing him back to the present. He was still the ruler, still the one who commanded everything. He would not falter, not now. The Shinobi Alliance could try all they wanted to bring him down, but he had already risen far beyond their reach. Yet, there was still a lingering doubt, something tugging at the back of his mind, and no matter how much he tried to suppress it, the doubt remained. Naruto let out a long breath and stood, his demonic aura flaring brightly as his will surged through the air. The fortress shook with the intensity of his power, but it was nothing compared to the storm that raged within him. He raised a hand, and the ground before him began to crack open, massive pillars of dark energy spiraling upward. The forces outside felt it, too. The eruption of power was undeniable. He could unleash Zerth's full power, use the demon's true strength to obliterate the Shinobi Alliance in a single blow, but something inside him held back. The thought of doing so, of consuming everything around him in the name of control, left him cold. There was a part of him, buried deep within, that recoiled at the thought. It was a lingering trace of humanity, something he had long since buried under the weight of his ambitions. Master, a voice suddenly interrupted his thoughts. Naruto turned to see one of his generals approaching, a hulking figure wrapped in dark armor. The general knelt before him, his head bowed in deference. The Shinobi Alliance is advancing toward the inner sanctum, the general reported, his voice low and filled with tension. They are relentless. We need your power to crush them. Naruto's gaze hardened, and he nodded. The time for hesitation was over. There was no going back now. Prepare the demons, Naruto commanded. We will break their lines. No mercy. The general stood, bowing once more before rushing off to relay the orders. Naruto watched him go, his heart still unsettled. His thoughts were interrupted by another, more personal presence. Hinata. The thought of her pierced through the chaos in his mind like a knife. He had seen her face so many times, seen her desperation to reach him, to save him from himself. In the midst of the siege, she had infiltrated the fortress, determined to find Naruto and pull him back from the brink. She had navigated through traps and dangers, her determination unwavering. But Naruto could feel her presence growing closer, a warmth in the cold darkness that had consumed him. His mind flickered back to their time together, the quiet moments, the gentle words, the warmth of her touch. She had never given up on him, never once turned her back, even when he had chosen a path of destruction. It was that unwavering belief in him that kept him from completely falling into Zerth's grip. In his darkest moments, her voice had been the only thing that could reach him, the only thing that reminded him of the person he once was. But now, as the armies of the Shinobi Alliance closed in, he wondered if it was too late. He had chosen his path long ago, and there was no easy way back. Even if he wanted to save her, could he truly escape the grip of the demon within him? His thoughts were interrupted once again, this time by a different presence. Sasuke. The Uchiha, once his closest friend, now stood as one of the leaders of the assault on his fortress. Naruto could feel the weight of their history between them, the bitterness, the rivalry, and the unspoken understanding of the paths they had chosen. Sasuke had joined the Shinobi Alliance, bringing with him a specialized assault team that sought to breach the inner sanctum of the fortress. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he sensed Sasuke's chakra drawing closer. He had always known that their paths would cross again. The Uchiha had always been a challenge, a reminder of the person Naruto had once aspired to be. But now, their roles had reversed. Sasuke had become the one fighting for the world, while Naruto had become the one who sought to destroy it. The tension between them was palpable, a clash of ideologies that had been brewing for years. It was inevitable, and now, the time had come. Naruto raised his hand again, his fingers twitching with the surge of power that ran through him. His demonic aura flared, rippling across the room, as he prepared for the final confrontation. His thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt, regret, and rage, but there was one certainty in the storm of his mind. The siege had begun, and this time, there would be no mercy. The air in the throne room was thick with the oppressive weight of Naruto's power. Shadows clung to the walls like living things, twisted and sinister, in stark contrast to the once proud sanctuary that had once been a symbol of his invincibility. Now, it was a hollow shell, a reflection of the battle raging within its ruler. Naruto stood at the far end of the room, his back to the giant throne, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The demon's influence was suffocating, swirling around him like a storm cloud, pulling at his every thought, every shred of his remaining humanity. Zerth's presence was an ever-constant force, whispering in the back of his mind, feeding his anger, fueling the darkness that had consumed him. His eyes glowed a brilliant red, his demonic aura rippling violently around him as if it were alive, eager to break free and obliterate everything in its path. In the midst of it all, there was only one person who dared to approach him. Hinata. She stepped into the throne room, her eyes filled with determination, her face etched with the desperation of someone who loved him and refused to let him go. Her presence was a stark contrast to the dark storm that raged around him. The soft glow of her chakra, though faint, was a beacon in the midst of the malevolent energy that enveloped the room. Naruto's gaze flickered toward her for a moment, his heart twisting. He had seen her eyes like this before, full of hope, full of faith in him. But now, in the face of the destruction he had wrought, those eyes seemed like a distant memory. He wanted to reach out to her, to pull her close, to protect her from the abyss he had become, but he couldn't. He couldn't trust himself anymore. Hinata took a step forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "Naruto, please." Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken feelings. "This path you're on, it's not you. It's not who you are." Her plea hit him like a wave, crashing over him with the force of all the emotions he had buried deep inside. His heart ached, a sharp, piercing pain that threatened to tear him apart. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't go back. The power of Zerth had a hold on him, and the thought of relinquishing it was unthinkable. "You don't understand," Naruto said, his voice low and strained. "You don't know what it's like to have everything taken from you. To be abandoned by the world. I had to claw my way to this point. And now, I won't let anyone take it away from me. Not even you." Hinata shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Naruto, I know the pain you felt. I know what it's like to feel alone. But this isn't the way. You don't have to be like this. Please, let me help you." Her words hit him like a physical blow. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to push her away, to reject her pleas and continue on his path of destruction. Zerth's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to crush her, to eliminate any trace of weakness. But then something shifted. A crack in his resolve. A sliver of doubt, a whisper of humanity that refused to be extinguished. His eyes flickered, the red glow dimming for just a moment. "You can't help me," Naruto said, the words strained, as though they were being forced out of him. "I've gone too far." Hinata stepped closer, undeterred. "I believe in you, Naruto. I always have." As she took another step forward, her presence was like a soothing balm to the raging storm inside him. The darkness recoiled, just for a moment, before Zerth's angered voice filled his mind. "You fool!" Zerth roared. "You are mine. You belong to me. Do not let her sway you." Naruto flinched, the force of Zerth's voice almost making him stumble. His hand twitched at his side, and the air around him crackled with power. The chains that held the demon within him tightened, pulling at his very essence. He could feel Zerth pushing against his will, trying to dominate him completely. Hinata's gaze never wavered. "Naruto, I know you. You are not the monster you think you are. Please, fight this. Fight him." Naruto's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that he could still be the person he once was, the person she saw in him. But Zerth's influence was overwhelming, and he could feel the demon clawing at his mind, demanding control. In that moment, everything seemed to fracture. His vision blurred, his mind swimming between two realities, the world as it was and the world as Zerth wished it to be. He could see flashes of memories of a time before the darkness had consumed him, of moments with Hinata that now seemed like distant dreams. But they were fading, slipping away like sand through his fingers. Hinata reached out to him, her hand trembling. "Naruto, please." In that instant, Zerth's power surged, and Naruto lost control. The demonic aura around him flared to life, erupting in a violent burst of energy. The throne room shook as the raw power ripped through the air, and Hinata was thrown back by the force. But she did not retreat. She struggled to stand, her eyes filled with determination as she tried to reach him once more. Naruto's vision darkened as Zerth's influence took full control. The demon's power surged within him, filling every inch of his being with unrelenting fury. His body trembled with the intensity of the energy coursing through him, and for a moment, he was nothing but a vessel for the demon's wrath. "You are weak, Naruto," Zerth's voice sneered. "She is nothing more than a distraction. A tool for your weakness. Eliminate her, and all will be yours." Naruto's body moved on its own, his hands raising toward Hinata, as if to strike her down. But something inside him screamed in protest. His heart, though battered and broken, still refused to give in completely. He locked eyes with her, and in that moment, everything seemed to slow. Her face, filled with pain and fear, was the last thing he wanted to destroy. The love they had shared, the moments of happiness, the hope she had always brought him, they all surged to the forefront of his mind. With a desperate cry, Naruto fought back. His hands shook as he tried to rein in Zerth's power, the demon fighting him every step of the way. The air around him crackled as he struggled to maintain control, his body shaking with the effort. The darkness roared within him, but it was weakening. Naruto's eyes flickered back to their normal color, the red slowly fading from his gaze as the demon's hold loosened. Finally, with one final, overwhelming push, Naruto regained control. His hand trembled as it fell to his side, and the demon's power receded into the shadows. He collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Hinata rushed to his side, her arms wrapping around him, holding him steady. "Naruto, please, you don't have to do this. You're not alone." For a moment, he could do nothing but sit there, leaning against her, his body broken and exhausted. The weight of his actions, the destruction, the violence, the chaos pressed down on him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the burden of it all. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered, his voice filled with anguish. Hinata's fingers gently brushed through his hair, her touch soft and comforting. "You're Naruto. The person who never gave up, the person who cared for everyone. You can still be him. I believe in you." Naruto's heart tightened as he looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty and pain. But in her gaze, he saw something he hadn't felt in so long: hope. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to believe in it, too. "I don't want to be this," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Hinata nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Then don't be. I'm with you, no matter what." The darkness inside him recoiled, but it was not gone. It would always be a part of him. But in that moment, Naruto realized something important. He didn't have to fight it alone. He didn't have to embrace the darkness completely. There was still a part of him that could reach for the light. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to find a path back from the edge of destruction. The battlefield trembled as the force of Zerth's power surged through the land, turning the once lush plains into a desolate wasteland. Naruto's fortress had been the site of a brutal siege, but now the destruction was not just the result of the Shinobi Alliance's assault. No, it was the manifestation of something far darker, something that had awoken within Naruto. The sky, once a calm and tranquil blue, was now a swirling storm of black and crimson. Dark clouds rolled across the heavens, casting long, foreboding shadows over the ruined land. The ground shook violently as Zerth fully emerged from the depths of Naruto's mind, an overwhelming, demonic presence that eclipsed all light. The Demon King towered above the battlefield, his body cloaked in shadows, his eyes burning with a fiery rage. Dark wings stretched out from his back, the very air vibrating with the raw energy he radiated. Naruto stood before him, but he was no longer the boy who had once dreamed of becoming a great shinobi. The boy who had desired acceptance, who had longed to be seen for who he was. Now, he was a vessel for something far more dangerous. The man who had once been known as Naruto Uzumaki had been swallowed by the abyss, and in his place, there was only the Demon King. The Shinobi Alliance, already battered by the siege, now found themselves caught in the eye of a storm they couldn't comprehend. They had come to destroy Naruto, to end his reign of terror, but instead, they were faced with the true extent of his power. They faltered, their attacks ineffective against the overwhelming force that Zerth commanded. In an instant, entire platoons were wiped out, their bodies reduced to ash by the Demon King's destructive energy. On the opposite side, Naruto's followers, those who had once believed in him as their leader, watched in awe and terror. They kneeled, not out of loyalty but out of fear, their hearts gripped by the presence of the dark entity that had overtaken their king. To them, this was the return of a god, an unstoppable force that would reshape the world according to his will. They did not see Naruto anymore. They saw Zerth, the Demon King. The ground beneath them cracked and shattered as Zerth raised his hand, summoning a torrent of dark energy that swirled around him like a whirlwind of malevolent power. With a single motion, he sent the energy cascading through the ranks of the Shinobi Alliance, ripping apart their formations, turning them into little more than debris scattered across the wasteland. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning flesh and the echoes of war cries. Naruto stood at the center of the chaos, his body trembling as Zerth's control over him deepened. His mind was a battleground. The voice of Zerth the Demon King roared within him, urging him to embrace the power he had so desperately sought for so long. But even now, deep within the recesses of his consciousness, a small part of Naruto still fought, still clung to the hope that there was a way out. Hours earlier, in the hidden depths of the Forest of Death, Naruto had been struggling to control the dark power that had begun to seep into him. It had started during a routine D-rank mission with Sasuke and Sakura, nothing more than a standard reconnaissance mission, or so it seemed. But everything changed when they encountered a group of rogue ninjas, intent on ambushing the young shinobi. The rogue ninjas were skilled, merciless, and quick. Sasuke, always the strong and capable fighter, was quickly injured in the skirmish, a poisoned kunai lodging deep into his side. The sight of his teammate falling ignited something within Naruto, a desperate fury that clouded his judgment. In that moment of panic and fear, the seal within him, one that had always held Zerth's power at bay, shuddered. The Demon King's influence seeped through, and Naruto felt it. The overwhelming urge to fight back, to protect his friends, to prove himself, those desires mixed with the demon's promises of power, of revenge, of freedom. His control faltered, and the dark energy exploded from him in a torrent, decimating the rogue ninjas in an instant. The sheer force of the attack left a crater in the ground where the enemies had once stood, their bodies disintegrated by the dark energy. Sasuke and Sakura were horrified. Kakashi, who had been following from a distance, arrived just in time to see the aftermath. He watched, his face grim, as Naruto stood amidst the destruction, panting heavily, his eyes glowing red with the demon's power. "Naruto," Kakashi said softly, stepping forward, his voice tinged with concern. What did you do?" Naruto's chest heaved with each breath, his hands shaking as he struggled to regain control. The world around him seemed distant, blurred by the haze of the power that had overtaken him. He looked down at the bodies, his enemies, yes, but also a part of him. He had become the thing he had always feared. I didn't mean to," Naruto whispered, his voice filled with a mix of fear and confusion. But deep down, he knew. He knew this wasn't just a slip-up. This wasn't just a moment of rage. This was something darker, something he had no control over. Kakashi's eyes softened with understanding, but there was a distant sadness in his gaze. He could see the internal conflict in Naruto, could feel the demon's presence swirling beneath the surface, threatening to consume him completely. "Naruto," Kakashi said gently, "you need to get control of this. You can't let it take over." But it was already too late. The voice in Naruto's mind, Zerth's voice, whispered promises of power, of vengeance. It beckoned him, urging him to embrace his true nature, to stop fighting and surrender. Naruto could feel it, a pull deep within him, irresistible and consuming. And, In his fear, he ran. He fled into the forest, the dark energy swirling around him, feeding off his desperation. There, in the isolation of the trees, Zerth's voice grew louder, more insistent. "You were never meant to be human," it said. "You were always meant to be a god. Embrace it. Let go of your weakness." Naruto fell to his knees in the forest, clutching his head in pain as the demon's power surged through him. He wanted to fight it, to push it away, but it was too strong, too overwhelming. Zerth's influence crept into every corner of his mind, feeding off his insecurities, his doubts, and his deepest fears. "You've always been alone, Naruto," Zerth continued, his voice smooth and taunting. "No one truly cares for you. They will never accept you. But I will. I will make you the ruler of this world. I will make them all kneel before you." Tears blurred Naruto's vision as he struggled against the tide of darkness. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to protect the people he cared about. But the darkness felt like the only thing that had ever truly accepted him. And as Zerth's voice coaxed him, he made the decision. With a tremulous breath, Naruto agreed. He would train under Zerth's guidance, and in doing so, he would gain the power to shape the world in his image. Now, standing in the ruins of the battlefield, Naruto could feel the full weight of his decision. Zerth's power flowed through him like an unstoppable tide, reshaping the world in his image. He felt invincible, godlike, yet at the same time, a part of him screamed for mercy, for release from the chains that bound him. But that part of him was a whisper now, drowned out by the roar of the Demon King. Zerth's influence was complete, and there was no turning back. Naruto, or rather Zerth, raised his hand, and the land trembled as a cataclysmic wave of dark energy cascaded over the battlefield. The Shinobi Alliance fought valiantly, but they were nothing compared to the might of the Demon King. Their efforts were futile. The battlefield was now a wasteland, a monument to the destruction Naruto had brought upon the world. Yet, even as Zerth's power flowed through him, something in the depths of Naruto's consciousness flickered. A faint, fragile light. Hinata's unwavering belief in him flickered in the dark. She had reached him before. Could she reach him again? Would he let her? But the moment passed quickly. Zerth's grip tightened, and Naruto was lost once more to the darkness. The world around Naruto had become a nightmarish wasteland, an unforgiving reflection of the chaos he had unleashed. The ground was scorched, twisted, and broken, littered with the remnants of battles fought by both sides. Dark clouds still lingered in the sky, swirling in an unnatural dance, a manifestation of the Demon King's overwhelming presence. Yet now, as the dust settled, Zerth had been sealed away, forced back into the depths from which he had come. The demon's hold on Naruto was broken, but the cost had been unbearable. Naruto collapsed to his knees, every muscle in his body screaming in exhaustion. His once proud form now appeared frail, weakened by the immense power he had channeled and the mental battles he had fought. Sweat dripped down his face, his breath shallow, and his mind was a maze of fractured memories and overwhelming guilt. He had been the vessel for something terrible, something that had reshaped not only the world but also himself. But as Zerth receded into the darkness, Naruto was left with nothing but the silence of a battlefield, the echoes of his actions hanging in the air like a storm that had yet to fully dissipate. Hinata, though injured herself, was by his side in an instant. Her eyes were filled with concern, but they also held something else, something that Naruto had never thought he would see again: hope. She knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder as she whispered his name softly, urging him to hold on, to come back to her. But Naruto, still drowning in the aftermath of his transformation, could barely hear her. He was numb, lost in the weight of everything he had done. His thoughts were muddled, and the flickering memories of his previous life, the one where he had dreamed of being Hokage, of protecting his village, seemed distant and unreachable. "Hinata," he whispered weakly, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this. You don't have to fix it alone, Naruto, she replied, her voice unwavering despite the pain she was clearly in. We can rebuild. Together. But before Naruto could respond, the air grew tense. The sound of approaching footsteps signaled the arrival of others, shadows looming in the distance, their purpose clear. The Shinobi Alliance had not yet been defeated, and they had not forgotten the havoc Naruto had wrought. Tsunade and Jiraiya, both battle-worn and weary, emerged from the smoke and rebel. Tsunade's gaze was filled with an anger that was tempered by something else, an understanding that this battle was not over, even if the Demon King had been sealed. Jiraiya stood behind her, his expression grave. He had seen the devastation, felt the lingering darkness that had clung to Naruto. He knew this was far from the end. But for now, they had to make a choice. Tsunade turned her gaze to the remaining forces, her voice strong, commanding. Enough, Tsunade said, her tone brokering no argument. We stop here. Her words echoed across the battlefield, but the alliance was divided. Some of the shinobi, their hearts still burning with the desire for retribution, hesitated. Others, sensing the weight of the situation, began to lower their weapons. Jiraiya's eyes, however, never left Naruto. He saw the boy, the man he had once known, the one who had fought so desperately for acceptance. But what stood before him now was a reflection of something far darker, something beyond even his understanding. Sasuke, always brooding, always driven by his own desires for vengeance, stepped forward from the ranks of the alliance. His eyes burned with a fury that was familiar, a fire that had once driven him down the path of darkness. He stared at Naruto, his gaze cold and unforgiving. You think you can undo everything you've done? Sasuke spat, his voice harsh and biting. You've killed, you've destroyed, you've corrupted everything in your path, and now you want redemption? After everything you've done to this world. Naruto's chest tightened at Sasuke's words. He had heard the accusations before, but they never stung quite like they did now. Sasuke was right. Naruto had failed. He had fallen prey to Zerth's manipulation, and in doing so, he had shattered everything he had once held dear. The bond he had with Sasuke, the bond he had with Konoha, had all crumbled beneath the weight of his own choices. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Naruto murmured, his voice hoarse and broken. But I didn't want any of this. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Sasuke's eyes narrowed, his hands clenched into fists. He had always struggled with forgiveness, with the idea of letting go of the past. He had once sought vengeance against those who had wronged him, and now, the same feeling burned within him, directed at the person he had once called a friend. You're right, Sasuke said coldly. You don't deserve forgiveness. But you'll get it anyway. With that, he prepared his Chidori, the deadly energy crackling in his hand as he aimed it directly at Naruto's heart. The raw power of the technique illuminated the darkness around him, and in that moment, it seemed as though time itself had come to a standstill. But before Sasuke could strike, Hinata stepped forward, her eyes wide with fear but her resolve unshaken. She placed herself between Naruto and Sasuke, standing tall despite the blood dripping from her wounds. No, Sasuke, she pleaded, her voice steady, though her body trembled. Don't do this. He's not the same. He's not the demon anymore. Sasuke hesitated, the Chidori flickering as he stared at Hinata's determined expression. He had always been driven by his own hatred, his desire to avenge his clan, but Hinata's words gave him pause. He knew the kind of strength she carried within her. She wasn't just protecting Naruto, she was protecting something deeper, something he couldn't quite comprehend. But it was too late. In a final surge of emotion, Sasuke thrust his hand forward, the Chidori crackling with raw power. Hinata, with no time to dodge, stepped forward once more, positioning herself between Naruto and the oncoming attack. The Chidori pierced her chest, and her body crumpled to the ground in an instant. "Hinata!" Naruto cried, his voice filled with horror. His entire being froze as he watched her fall, her life slipping away in front of him. In that moment, everything came crashing down. The weight of his actions, the consequences of his choices, everything he had ever feared was now laid bare. Sasuke stood motionless, his eyes widening as he saw what he had done. The harsh reality of his actions hit him like a wave. He had tried to strike Naruto, but in doing so, he had nearly destroyed the one person who had always stood by him. Naruto's hands trembled as he knelt beside Hinata, his heart hammering in his chest. She was barely conscious, her breaths shallow and weak. The pain in her eyes was palpable, but even then, she smiled faintly, a smile that told him everything he needed to know. "Hinata," Naruto whispered, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this. I didn't mean for you to." But she silenced him with a gentle touch, her fingers weakly tracing his cheek. "I believe in you, Naruto," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can still save us." Naruto felt a surge of energy rush through him, an energy that was both destructive and redemptive. It was the last of Zerth's power, but this time, he controlled it. His body glowed with a dark aura as he channeled the energy, focusing on healing Hinata, on saving her. A burst of light erupted from him, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire world held its breath. The darkness that had clung to him receded, leaving only the light of his resolve. Slowly, Hinata's wound began to heal, the wound closing as the power of Zerth, now under Naruto's control, worked to restore her life. When the light faded, Hinata's breathing had steadied. She was still alive. But Naruto knew the price of her sacrifice would haunt him forever. His followers, those who had once stood behind him, watched from a distance, their faces filled with a mix of awe and fear. They had believed in his power, had worshipped him as their king. But now, they saw him for what he truly was, a broken man who had lost everything in his pursuit of power. "I failed you all," Naruto said, his voice filled with regret. "I failed myself." One by one, his followers scattered, their loyalty wavering as they accepted defeat. The war was over, but the world he had sought to rule had been shattered beyond repair. But even as everything crumbled around him, Naruto understood something vital. He had been given a second chance, a chance to atone for the destruction he had caused, to rebuild what he had torn apart. It would take time, and it would take sacrifice. But with Hinata by his side, and with the lessons of the past burned into his heart, he would fight to rebuild not just the world but himself. And so, as the sun began to rise over the desolate battlefield, Naruto vowed to make things right. The shinobi world might be in ruins, but it was not the end. It was only the beginning of something new. Naruto stood at the edge of the ruined village, watching the sun dip below the horizon, its orange hues casting a warm glow over the charred remains of the once thriving settlement. The village was a casualty of the war that had ravaged the land, its buildings reduced to rubble, its people either dead or scattered to the winds. Yet, there was something in the air tonight, an almost tangible sense of peace, a fleeting hope amidst the despair. He had been working for months to rebuild what had been lost. Every day was a battle, not just against the broken world around him, but against the chaos brewing inside his heart. The power he had wielded to crush his enemies and claim victory had come at a heavy price. Naruto knew he was no longer the same person who had once dreamed of becoming Hokage, of earning the villagers' respect through hard work and dedication. The darkness that had taken root in him, the power of Zerth, had altered him in ways he couldn't fully understand. Despite his efforts, there were whispers. Fear. Resentment. Many in the villages he helped rebuild saw him as little more than a monster, a destroyer disguised as a savior. They feared the power in his hands, the same power that had once brought ruin to Konoha. Yet, there were others, fewer in number, but significant, who saw something different in him. They saw a man who had suffered, who had been abandoned by his own people, but who still found the strength to move forward, to try and make the world a better place. They admired his resolve, even if they didn't fully understand it. Hinata was the only constant in Naruto's life. She had stood by him throughout his journey, even when the rest of the world had turned its back on him. She had been his anchor, her love a lifeline that kept him tethered to something good, something pure. But even her presence wasn't enough to quiet the storm that raged within him. Tonight, as he walked through the village, his mind was weighed down by the same thoughts that had haunted him for months. Zerth's voice echoed in his mind, tempting him with promises of ultimate power, of revenge against those who had wronged him. The dark energy within him stirred, and Naruto's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew what Zerth wanted. He wanted Naruto to embrace his power fully, to wield it without restraint. But Naruto wasn't sure if he could control the darkness anymore. "Don't let it take over," he whispered to himself, but the words felt hollow. As he passed through the village, he saw the faces of those who had been displaced by the war. The widows, the orphans, the broken people who had lost everything. They looked at him with a mix of gratitude and fear, their expressions betraying their conflicting emotions. To them, he was both their savior and their tormentor, a man who had saved them but at the cost of everything they had known. Naruto sighed heavily and continued walking, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had killed countless people in the name of vengeance, and though the war had ended, the consequences of his choices lingered. He couldn't undo the past, but he could try to shape the future. That was the only hope he had left. Later that night, Naruto sat in the quiet of his tent, staring at the flickering flame of a small fire. The darkness inside him stirred again, more insistent this time. Zerth's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was enough to make Naruto's skin crawl. "Why fight it, Naruto? You know what you are capable of. You could have everything. Power beyond your wildest dreams. All you have to do is embrace me." Naruto's eyes narrowed, his fists trembling with barely contained anger. "I've already made my choice," he muttered under his breath. Zerth chuckled, a dark, hollow sound. "Have you? Or are you just lying to yourself? You think you're different, but you're just like the rest of them, weak, pathetic, holding yourself back from what you truly deserve." The words hit hard. Naruto could feel the darkness rising within him, tempting him to give in, to let go of his self-imposed limits and unleash his power without restraint. He had felt that rush before, the thrill of destruction, of having the world bow before him. It was intoxicating, and he had to fight the urge to give in. A soft voice interrupted his internal struggle. "Naruto." He turned to see Hinata standing in the entrance of the tent, her gentle expression laced with concern. Her eyes were soft, her face still the same as it had been when they first met, full of kindness and warmth. She had been with him through so much, and yet, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was slowly pulling away from her. "I'm fine," Naruto said, though his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Just thinking." Hinata stepped into the tent, her gaze never leaving his. She knew him better than anyone, and she could sense the darkness that clung to him. It wasn't the power he had gained, it was the toll it had taken on his soul. She approached him slowly, as if afraid he might shatter if she got too close. "Please, Naruto," she said softly. "I know you're hurting. But this isn't the way. You can't keep carrying this burden alone." He looked at her, his heart aching with guilt. "I don't want to hurt you, Hinata. But I'm not sure how much longer I can control it." She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not alone. I'm here with you, always. We can figure this out together." Naruto closed his eyes, torn between the woman who had stood by him and the darkness that called to him. For a moment, he felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. Could he let go of the power Zerth offered? Could he find a way to balance the light and the darkness within him? Before he could answer, the ground beneath them trembled, and the sound of an explosion rang through the air. The village was under attack. The battle was swift and brutal. Naruto barely had time to react before the enemy ninja descended upon them. It was a group of rogue shinobi, likely former mercenaries who had taken advantage of the chaos in the world. They came at Naruto with everything they had, but their attacks were clumsy, their strategy lacking. They didn't know who they were up against. Hinata fought alongside him, her Byakugan active, detecting their movements with ease. But even with their combined strength, the rogue ninjas were relentless. They were playing on Naruto's insecurities, trying to provoke him, to push him past the breaking point. "You're weak," one of the mercenaries taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "You think you're a hero? You're nothing but a killer, a puppet of the darkness." Naruto felt his temper rising, the familiar stirrings of rage threatening to consume him. He could feel Zerth's presence inside him, urging him to give in, to wipe the enemy out without mercy. "Don't listen to them, Naruto," Hinata shouted, her voice cutting through the fog of anger. "You're not what they say you are." But it was too late. Zerth seized control. Naruto's eyes turned dark, and in an instant, the rogue ninja were decimated. The air was filled with the sound of snapping bones and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. The last remaining enemy froze, his eyes wide with terror. Naruto stood among the wreckage, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands were coated in blood, and the stench of death filled the air. He could feel Zerth's laughter echoing in his mind, a cold, mocking sound. "This is who you really are, Naruto," Zerth purred. "Embrace it?" But as Naruto looked down at the bodies, something inside him snapped. He felt disgusted by what he had done. He had crossed a line, one that he wasn't sure he could come back from. The darkness inside him had taken over, and it had been too easy. He staggered backward, shaking his head. "No, this isn't who I am." Hinata's voice reached him again, this time softer, full of concern. "Naruto, please. You don't have to let it control you. You can fight it?" He looked at her, his heart heavy with shame. "I don't know if I can. I'm losing myself, Hinata. I'm scared." Hinata took a step forward, her hand reaching out. "Then let me help you, Naruto. You don't have to face this alone. You can still find the light inside you. I believe in you." The words struck him like a lifeline thrown into the stormy sea. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. He had someone who believed in him, who was willing to fight alongside him. He had to believe that he could overcome the darkness, that he could still find redemption. The battle was over, but the war within Naruto was far from finished. He had made a vow to himself, a vow to never again let the darkness consume him. He would find a way to coexist with the power inside him, to use it responsibly. No matter how tempting it was, he would never let it take control again. He could still be the man he wanted to be. A protector. A leader. And, with Hinata by his side, he could rebuild not just the villages, but his own shattered soul. The dawn of a new era had begun, but Naruto knew that the true battle lay ahead, the battle to master himself, to walk the fine line between light and darkness. And he wouldn't face it alone.